Welcome to UEN SciFi Friday, the podcast where science fiction film meets real science. I'm Rich Finlinson of the Utah Education Network. This week's film is The Screaming Skull.
Parts of the movie were funny to me, parts of the movie seemed silly, and I got scared, which is embarrassing to admit.
That's Renee Galliher, professor of psychology at Utah State University in Logan. We'll have more with her in a moment, but first some background on the movie. The Screaming Skull stars John Hudson and Peggy Weber as newlyweds living at the home of the groom's late wife. The movie tagline says, "A tortured ghost claims vengeance in the bride's bedroom." And one of the movie's promo lines offered a free coffin if you don't die of fright. Much of the plot depends on the mental instability of Weber's character, the new bride Jenny Whitlock. Renee Galliher says Jenny does show symptoms of a mental disorder.
Well, based on the little bit of information that was provided in the film, probably the most likely diagnosis for her would be post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a condition that is characterized by experiencing either a life-threatening traumatic experience where there is a threat to bodily integrity, or you observe a traumatic experience happening to someone else, observe a death or a horrible injury or something like that. So that certainly occurred to her.
The Screaming Skull was shot in black and white and released in 1959. It runs 58 minutes and is available on several DVD releases as a double feature with films like Attack of the Giant Leeches and Werewolf vs. the Vampire. You're listening to UEN SciFi Friday. Now here's the full interview with this week's guest expert.
This is Autumn Thatcher with the Utah Education Network, and I am sitting with Professor Renee Galliher, Professor of Psychology at Utah State University. Today we are going to discuss the 1958 film, The Screaming Skull. Professor Galliher, what sort of things do you do in your line of work?
Well, I'm a clinical psychologist, but I'm also an academic psychologist, so my work is varied. I am predominantly involved in teaching. I teach both undergraduate and graduate level courses, and I mentor undergraduate and graduate students in psychology. I also am involved in supervising graduate students' clinical work, and I do my own clinical work with adolescents and couples and adults.
What steps did you take to prepare for a career in psychology?
Well, I have a doctoral degree in psychology, which is what you need to have in order to be licensed as a clinical psychologist. I did a 4-year bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree in psychology, and then went on to a doctoral degree. In order to be a clinical psychologist or counseling psychologist, you also have to do a full-time internship and postdoctoral training in order to complete your qualifications.
What did you think of the 1958 film, The Screaming Skull?
Well, it was intriguing. I enjoyed parts of it. I don't watch a lot of older movies, and I very rarely watch horror movies because I'm so easily frightened. Parts of the movie were funny to me, parts of the movie seemed silly, and I got scared, which is embarrassing to admit.
The characters in the film insinuate that the lead female character, Jenny Whitlock, was insane. Based on your experience, how would you define insanity?
Insanity actually isn't a psychological diagnosis or a clinical term. It's actually a legal term that, in terms of making an insanity defense or an insanity plea, and so actually a lawyer would probably be more appropriate in terms of talking about how to define insanity. I think in terms of my understanding of the lead female character, there are lots of ways to think about it, about her experience in terms of psychological diagnoses and mental disorders and things like that, but insanity itself is not necessarily a psychological diagnosis.
How would you diagnose her? What sort of terms would you use to diagnose her based on what you saw in the film?
Well, based on the little bit of information that was provided in the film, probably the most likely diagnosis for her would be post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a condition that is characterized by experiencing either a life-threatening traumatic experience where there is a threat to bodily integrity, or you observe a traumatic experience and happening to someone else, observe a death or a horrible injury or something like that. So that certainly occurred to her. And then in addition, post-traumatic stress disorder requires that the person experience recurring and intrusive memories or nightmares about the event, that they experience emotional numbing or an inability to connect with others because of the event, and she did experience some of those kinds of things.
How would you describe the behavior of Jenny's husband, Eric Whitlock?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I think that, there were lots of aspects of his behavior that could be characterized by kind of an antisocial or a sociopathic kind of tendency or approach that, some of the things that somebody with an antisocial kind of approach to life or an antisocial kind of personality would experience would be a lack of remorse when their behavior results in injury or when they are hurting other people, a lack of empathy, which means an inability to put yourself in other people's shoes and understand their perspectives, and that very utilitarian approach to relationships in life where really what you do is you get what you can get from other people and you don't concern yourself about how your behavior impacts them. So certainly his behavior fell into those categories.
Do you think that he could be described as narcissistic at all?
Well, a narcissistic personality type or personality construct is really usually characterized as someone who has an inflated self-esteem or a sense of grandiosity, that they are someone who presents themselves as superior and better than everyone else, but that narcissistic demeanor is usually characterized as kind of a facade or a defense against a fundamental core experience of inadequacy. So I think probably that's a less precise fit than some other characterizations.
What drives individuals to be as manipulative as Eric Whitlock's character was?
Well, lots of things. I mean, I think you can look at it at all kinds of different levels. I mean, at kind of a utilitarian level or basic level, things like greed, and really with regard to his behavior with her, it seemed to be driven by greed, and that he was trying to, that's the way they presented it in the movie, that he was trying to get her money. Underlying that has to be, though, that fundamental lack of empathy, lack of consideration for other people. So in order for a person to feel like it is appropriate and okay to kill someone or drive them insane or do whatever in order to get their money, you have to have that fundamental disregard for other people's rights and privileges and that kind of fundamental lack of ability to put yourself in other people's shoes.
Would you say that his history of murdering his first wife and working to drive his second wife to the point of suicide could possibly make him insane? And I guess, as you indicated earlier, that it would be a legal term. If he were to have a defense attorney, do you think that they could or argue that he was insane?
Well, it seems, I watch a lot of episodes of Law and Order, so it seems to me like they'll make a legal defense of mental incompetence or insanity for almost anything. Mm-hmm. Although, again, that's my Law and Order experience speaking. Certainly, I think that he would qualify for some psychological diagnoses. The most obvious one that comes to my mind is something like antisocial personality disorder. I think that it would be a very difficult case, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but I think it would be very difficult for a lawyer to make a case of an insanity plea for him. But like I said, I mean, who knows what they'll try.
Seriously. Are you personally conducting any sort of research here at Utah State University or outside of the university?
I do. I have an active research program. My area of research interest is adolescence, and I specifically study adolescent romantic relationship development, which is kind of interesting, somewhat related to the content of the movie. Mm-hmm. I study the development of relationships across adolescence. I'm interested in how adolescents interact with one another, how those relationship processes develop over time, and how they're related to adolescent individual psychological functioning and relationship qualities. I'm interested in predicting things like dating aggression and relationship satisfaction, and those kinds of things.
Well, based on the research that you do, would you say that there were any fundamental problems with Jenny Whitlock for engaging in a serious relationship with Eric and being blinded to his sort of manipulative power that he has over her?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think there's a lot of research and there's a lot of discussion in the lay literature about abusive relationships in general or manipulative relationships in particular. One thing you have to be really careful when you think about this is this whole idea of blaming the victim. So the idea that, was there something wrong with Jenny, or did she do something wrong that put her in that position? Mm-hmm. At a broader level, if you want to think about it in terms of, like at a social problem level, to blame abused women because they keep getting in relationships with abused men obviously has problems. But I think there's a fair amount of literature that talks about that women with histories of abuse have a reduced capacity to discriminate safe situations from unsafe situations. And so maybe they do make poorer choices when they're forming new relationships. And so yeah, it's a touchy and difficult to discuss situation, because I think that that there are certain relationship history, experiences, personality characteristics, those kinds of things that contribute to the choices we make in our romantic relationships, who we decide to engage in romantic relationships with. And sometimes our own relationship histories and our own personality characteristics lead us to make poor choices. But the other flip side of that is that you don't want to get into a situation where you're saying women who are in abused relationships are in abused relationships because they made that choice, So it's a tricky situation.
Where can Utah residents go to learn more about the research that you are studying and also about psychology in general?
There's some information about the work that I'm doing on the psychology department website for the Utah State University. The research that I have done previously is published in psychological journals that are available through any literature search and academic literature search. I think in terms of learning about psychology in general as a field, I think if people are interested in learning about psychology because they think they might want to become a student in psychology, or they might be interested in taking classes or learning more about it that way, visiting websites of psychology departments and those kinds of things I think are important. If you're interested in learning about psychology more because you want to know about specific diagnoses or about mental illness or about problems that you or someone that you care about might be experiencing, probably the best resource is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, the NAMI is the acronym for it, which is, I think, widely acknowledged as probably one of the most powerful public health awareness service organizations supporting the needs and rights of those with mental illness.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Mm-hmm.
This is Autumn Thatcher with the Utah Education Network, and I have been speaking with Renee Galliher, Professor of Psychology at Utah State University.
UEN SciFi Friday is a production of the Utah Education Network in collaboration with the Utah Museum of Natural History. Our production and web crew includes Kyle Anderson, Michelle Dumas, Karen Creer, Corey Stokes, and Autumn Thatcher. The executive producer is Laura Hunter. Find out more about the Screaming Skull and real-life careers in psychology at the UEN SciFi Friday website, online at uen.org/TV. I'm Rich Finlinson. Join us again next week for another podcast of UEN SciFi Friday.